General Secretary for the Boston 9/11 Truth Group and volunteer coordinator for New England for architects and engineers for 9/11 volunteers. It's my pleasure tonight to have all of you here this evening. We really appreciate your coming out and your interest in this subject. I particularly want to acknowledge, although not by name, there are so many people involved, those who put on this evening's program and marketed it out in a variety of ways that we each of you, and everyone who was involved in the Architects Boston Exposition over the past 3 days, where it's my understanding that several hundred architects and engineers signed a petition requesting a new investigation of the events of 9/11. So thank you everyone who had a part in that. Our program tonight is going to be, our program speaker is going to be Richard Gage, AIA, the founder and CEO of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. I've known Richard for about a decade, admired his work and appreciated him being the tip of the spear, so to speak, in presenting to the world the questions that we all have about how the buildings fell on 9/11/01. You're going to see in the film this evening a great deal of evidence that suggests that the formal narrative could not possibly be accurate. Richard is going to speak with you in a little bit more detail about that. Afterwards, would you ask me for your support for the work of architects and engineers? If you're impressed by what you see in the film tonight, we hope you all get a hand with that. Without ado, Richard Gage.
Thanks, everybody. I'm really glad you're here. I've been to Boston House from California several times. We keep wanting to reach more and more people. And so I have 3 questions for you, first of all, before we begin. And that is about the 3rd tower that came down on 9/11, which I was unaware of, and maybe you were too, or are. How many of you are relatively unfamiliar with the 3rd skyscraper that came down at the World Trade Center on 9/11? Relatively unfamiliar. If you put your hands way in the high, way high in the air, I'll actually count you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And how many well, this is very important. You're going to learn about this 3rd skyscraper tonight. And I'm going to actually ask you 2 more questions, which are important. How many of us have come into the room tonight? Here's the 3 questions. Agreeing with the official story, unsure, or may have already done your own research and came up with the conclusion that the towers were brought down by explosive demolition. First, the official story. Large jet planes hit the towers, explosion of jet fuel, weakening of the structural system, and a gravitational collapse down to the ground. No reason to believe otherwise. This is the official the cause of the collapses, according to our government and the media. And that's how you've arrived tonight. How many of us pretty much agree with the official story? Oh my God, nobody? Let's be honest. Not a soul. Maybe you're unsure. There are a few things you're here to check out this controversy. You're unsure. Go like this, I count you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Unsure. 10. And how many of you came already agreeing with the evidence for explosive demolition? Oh my God! Why don't you guys bring your friends? You don't have any. They don't listen. Oh dear. Oh my God. Well, we're going to have some resources for you tonight that will help you to get those friends back or lose some more. I'm not sure which way it might go. But I want to make sure that at least you're aware of what we have. Because as Chris mentioned, the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth are quite helpful in providing credibility for the cause of discussing the truth about 9/11, what really happened. At least what 2,730 architects and engineers believe happened, which is very helpful to most people, having that body of credibility. How many architects are here tonight? 1, 2, 3. I'm counting myself, 3. How many engineers? We're great. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How many normal people? Okay. Great. Fantastic.
Why are you normal?
It's my incredible pleasure, honor, to have teamed up with Eric Lawyer of Firefighters for 9/11 Truth, who has assembled 200 firefighters calling for a new investigation of the destruction of all 3 World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. And 3 or 4 years ago, now, he and I filmed this presentation, which is, I think, very powerful, because he and I team up. He from the firefighters' perspective, myself from the architects and engineers' perspective, I'm an architect, Eric and I go through 20 different myths that are commonly held or put forth by the government or put forth by the media about 9/11 in the process of giving you the scientific forensic evidence for the explosive demolition of the towers. Eric starts off with a bang, saying, well, his personal story, why he got into this. We finally edited this presentation just a couple of months ago, and we're delighted to be on tour now. This is, I think, our 6th stop. We've been to Newark, New Brunswick, Woodstock, Torrington, Greenville, Brattleboro, Worcester, Watertown tonight, and 4 more. Dover, Belfast, in Maine, if you have friends up there, and Brunswick and Lebanon. Very exciting. And that's on our website. The details for this, actually it's on our Facebook page, but you can go to our website to get there. Our website is ae911truth.org. So without further ado, I want to start the film. I hope you enjoy it. I hope it challenges you. I hope it gives you the information you came here for. And if it doesn't, we'll have a Q&A afterward. And guess what? We're going to go out to dinner after that. Where are we headed?
The firehouse.
No. No, this is Gail.
Not your average Joe's.
Where's Gail? Gail knows where we're going. Oh, there's Gail. Where are we going, Gail?
Not your average Joe's.
She's focusing on photography.
Not your average Joe's.
What?
Not your average Joe's.
Not your average Joe's. That's how they name stuff here in Boston. So if you can Google that, we'll actually get you an address before we enter into Q&A. But think about coming to dinner with us. When have you had the opportunity to ask a dozen conspiracy theorists, a dozen people who are looking for the truth about 9/11?
Evidence theory. Evidence theory.
What?
Evidence theory.
Evidence theorists. That sounds better already. Okay, enjoy the film. How do the lights work out?
My name is Michelle Weiss Little, sister of fallen hero, FDNY, firefighter David Martin Weiss.
Hey, I'm born for firefighting. Ever since I was a kid, you know, I knew what I wanted to do.
David was a firefighter, and firefighters risk their lives every day for their brothers and sisters, for you and for any of your family members. My brother would have gone into that building no matter who was in there, no matter who is responsible. He faced his fear, and he did his duty. As a country, we promised we would never forget. They gave their life. At the very least, we can give our time to demand a real investigation.
Good evening and welcome. Thank you for your courage and for your willingness to reconsider the very difficult subject of 9/11 and the destruction of the World Trade Center with its staggering loss of life. This effort of the 9/11 Truth Movement has proven to so many to be extremely difficult. Not so difficult in terms of the evidence and reaching conclusions, though, but difficult in terms of the implications of those conclusions. And finding people who are open-minded enough, like yourselves, to be willing to spend the time and re-examine the facts about the destruction of these high-rises and the subsequent investigations. Our commitment to you tonight is to speak the truth and to leave you with extremely valuable science-based information. But please Don't believe us. We're not looking for believers. We implore you, check out every fact that you hear tonight, because it's extremely important that we know the whole truth about this event. After all, it served as the pretext for the invasion and occupation of two countries in which over 1 million people have already perished, and the loss through legislation of many of our hard-won freedoms that we used to cherish here in America, as well as instituting abhorrent policies of extraordinary rendition and torture in the ensuing so-called global war on terror, plus a host of other ills that we're suffering from as a nation. Now, all of this remains intact if we continue to ignore or sweep the truth about 9/11 under the rug. And only the truth will stop another 9/11 type attack from happening again. We must dedicate ourselves to finding out exactly what really happened and why, and to bringing those actually responsible to justice. So these are among the many reasons that we must peer into this painful part of our recent world history and re-examine the destruction, the investigations, and the relatively new physical evidence from 9/11, most of which we haven't seen in the mainstream media. To identify the perpetrator, first know the crime. Tonight we focus on the forensic evidence found and destroyed at the crime scene, the eyewitness testimony, and the official government reports. So we're still seeking the truth, and tonight we will explore the myths of 9/11. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to tonight's speakers. These professionals have been willing to place their credibility and reputations on the line, and they've endured substantial personal sacrifice. They're tireless and tenacious advocates for questions that all too few are willing to ask, and truths that fewer still are willing to face, truths that may shake the foundations of our worldview. Let me introduce you to a venturesome architect of over 20 years here in the San Francisco Bay Area and a member of the prestigious American Institute of Architects. He's been employed with local San Francisco Bay Area architecture firms and is now devoting 100% of his time and energy to this cause. Like many other architects, he's designed many fireproofed steel frame buildings in his career. Most recently, he co-managed the construction documents work on a $400 million mixed-use project in Nevada with almost 2 million square feet of retail parking structure and fireproofed steel-framed mid-rise office space with over 1,200 tons of steel framing altogether. His deep concern about the destruction of the 3 World Trade Center high-rises on 9/11 began after his exposure to David Ray Griffin on KPFA's Guns and Butter program hosted by Bonnie Faulkner. This changed Mr. Gage's life radically and launched his own unyielding quest for the truth about 9/11, inspiring him to found the organization Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. Please give a warm welcome to Mr. Richard Gage, AIA. Richard?
Thank you. Thank you so much.
It's now an equal honor to introduce our featured speaker, a full-time 14-year firefighter who's assigned to Ladder 3 in the city of Seattle. Before becoming a firefighter, he was a paramedic in the Sacramento area for 8 years, leaving the Sacramento Fire Department for Seattle in '96. Altogether, over 22 years of experience in emergency services. He graduated with a Bachelor's of Science in Mathematics from the University of California at Davis. In 2008, startled yet inspired by the factual and irrefutable presentation of the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, he decided that someone must step forward and take the heat for the truth. His 343 fallen brothers deserved no less. He felt that he had no choice in the matter. Like Richard Gage before him, it came forth as if a haunted, persistent calling. And so he founded the Firefighters for 9/11 Truth, demanding a new investigation of the destruction of these 3 high-rises and an investigation of the investigators themselves. Please welcome the courageous Eric Lawyer, Firefighters for 9/11 Truth.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and we really appreciate the courage you have to show up and the openness you have to listen to what we have to say tonight. And I'm just going to start by telling a little bit about my story and how I came to change my views on this completely. Right after 9/11, I tried everything I could to get out to Ground Zero. I was on a team that we thought they were going to call up, but they didn't, and they ended up calling up a USAR team instead. Anyways, I went out there for the funerals. I helped support however I could. This was there about a month and a half after Ground Zero. And so I was very emotionally attached to it. When anyone would talk about it, I couldn't listen. I just didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to consider it. And my lieutenant for years had told me that it looked like, something didn't add up. And I just told him he was crazy. He should leave the country. I'm very patriotic, and I just thought, if you believe that anyone could be responsible for this, you shouldn't be here. It was a friend of mine from the military that actually opened my eyes to something else. And one thing led to another, and I kept looking. 9/11 kept coming up. And because it wasn't being shoved down my throat, I decided to look into it a little bit more. And when I did, I knew there was a lot of conspiracy theories out there and a lot of crazy conspiracy theories. And I decided to do my own research. And so I went to the Zacarias Moussaoui exhibit trials. This is the U.S. government's evidence on 9/11, basically. And I wanted to see what they had. I was kind of shocked. I wanted to know, how did they identify the terrorists so quickly? How were they so sure? And so as I started looking, this is what I found, and this is the main evidence that they had. This was found after the plane crash. This was found the next day. So you can see they found bandanas, papers, more passports. You can see these passports. They're pretty well intact. I've been to a lot of fires, and if they're out in a room that's not on fire, we'll find this kind of stuff. But the thing that stuck out to me, and someone else had pointed out, was, well, wait a second. Those passports, those IDs, they were inside either pockets or luggage or inside that plane. Then that plane hit those towers or went into the field or went into the Pentagon, and then they blew up. There were big fireballs we all saw, and then they were found actually on top of the pile. So that stuff started not adding up for me. I was like, well, wait a second. How'd they find it the next day? It should have been either on the ground or burned up or buried in the rubble. That led to Colonel Nelson. Once I started looking into this, I read his article, and he's a 34-year Air Force crash investigator, and he'd written a pretty amazing article, and he talks about his own experience into 9/11. And once I spoke with him, I asked him, I said, when did you first notice something was wrong? He said, for me, it was the first day. And I said, really? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, what stuck out to you? He said, well, I've been to a lot of crash sites. I know how they work. And he said, it was the Pentagon. And he said, when I looked at the Pentagon, and here's some pictures of it, he said, what I saw the first day was people picking up debris, and they were removing it as quickly as possible. He said, every crash I've ever been to, it's the MP's job to secure that area, flag it, tag it, take pictures. Nobody touches anything until after the investigators are there. Well, they were cleaning it up before any investigation. He said by day 3, he knew something was wrong. And by day 3 is when he said they identified the terrorists, and it was the IDs. He said, there's no way. He said, find those 19 terrorists. It would have taken weeks to months to find that kind of evidence, to sort through it, to go through it. And he said, they recreated the aircraft crash. He said it was impossible. So that really made me start thinking more. And the more I looked into it, the 9/11 Commission themselves, I found out, they doubt their own investigation. And so many people in America believe the 9/11 Commission. That's the people who believe the official story, they still swear by it. Well, I found out the investigators themselves don't.
So there are all kinds of reasons. We thought we were set up to fail. We got started late. We had a very short time frame. Indeed, we had to get it extended. We did not have enough money. They were afraid we were going to hang somebody, that we would point the finger.
Lee and I write in our book that we think the commission in many ways was set up to fail because we had not enough money, we didn't have enough time, we'd been appointed by the most partisan people in Washington.
So then you go to their own website. They talk here about how much they spent, the 9/11 Commission budget. It started out at $3 million. Congress then gave them an additional $11 million, and the total commission was $15 million. Now, to put that in perspective, you can see that the Columbia Space Shuttle investigation was $175 million. The Challenger investigation was $100. Monica Lewinsky was $30. 9/11 was the greatest crime in U.S. history, and we had the least amount of money going into this investigation, and we still believe that investigation. Then I went to the FBI, and I said, well, they're the lead investigators. What do they say about it? Found out he is on the most wanted list, but what's shocking is he's not on the most wanted list for 9/11. They've been asked about that, and they've said that they don't have enough evidence to accuse him. So this is on the FBI's most wanted list. Murder of U.S. nationals outside the United States, conspiracy to murder U.S. nationals outside the United States, attack on a federal facility resulting in death. He's also wanted connection with the August 7th, 98 bombings of United States embassies in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and Nairobi, Kenya. They never mention 9/11. They never mention the United States. The FBI doesn't have enough evidence. The 9/11 Commission doesn't believe in their own investigation. we should be looking at this and we should be holding them accountable. And the 9/11 Commission themselves, some of the commissioners have said, it's a national scandal and we need a real investigation. Thank you. The NFPA, this is what I first looked into when I started investigating it. And the NFPA is it's the National Fire Protection Association, and they set the standards for the fire service. They're not laws, they're not mandates that we have to follow, but they're guidelines. And as an example, it's staffing. If you don't follow certain rules going into a fire, you better have a good reason why the city's not doing it, because if someone gets hurt, they're going to get sued because they're not following the national standards. So the same thing happens with fire and explosion investigations. And this is the NFPA 921. This was approved as the national standard on February 9th, 2001. Now, there's no manual for when a plane flies into a building. They don't have to follow this exactly. What it was created for was for smaller cities that don't have their own investigation units. In this way, they could come in and they could see what are the basics that we should follow. And I've talked to some senior investigators in our department and actually across the country, and they've said they don't have to follow these exactly, but what they typically do is they go way beyond these. So we're going to be looking at the absolute basics. This is like 101. And so once you see what the basics call for, you're going to be surprised.
Myth. Normal evidence procedures were followed.
All right, well, we go back to the manual. 9.3.6.1, spoliation of evidence. Spoliation of evidence refers to the loss, destruction, or material alteration of an object or a document that is evidence or potential evidence in a legal proceeding by anyone who has responsibility for its preservation. It may occur when the movement, change, or destruction of evidence or the alteration of the scene significantly impairs the opportunity of other interested parties to obtain the same evidentiary value from the evidence as did prior investigators. Maintenance of evidence. After 9/11, there was a rescue and recovery operation going on. Whenever human life's there, we can break all the rules. We still do destroy the building before the investigators get there in what's called overhaul. And what that means is we have to search the ceilings and walls, we have to pull them apart to make sure there's no fire in those. And so we are destroying the point of origin a lot of times by doing that. But again, it's to stop the fire from burning more and to help rescue people. So it's normal for them to damage the evidence getting it out there. Now what they wouldn't do is eliminate it. So any destructive testing or destructive examination of the evidence may be necessary should occur only all reasonably known parties have been notified in advance and given the opportunity to participate in or observe the testing. So obviously NIST had an interest. They were an interested party since they were the lead investigators on the building collapse. So the evidence should have been preserved. And what we find out, and NIST themselves admits they had no physical evidence to do the investigation on World Trade Center 7. There's one fire chief in particular from New York. I've talked to him about it. He's actually written a book about this. And he said, I've heard this excuse a lot of times, and a lot of guys will just say, they'll shake their head and they'll just say, well, it's incompetence. You know, it was so much confusion. We didn't know what was going on. Well, we're talking about this was days after they started removing it, but this went on for months. You can't just make a 47-story building disappear. We protect the point of origin in a house fire. We remove the debris. We put it in a pile sometimes so the investigator can go through it. We tell the investigator where it is. We don't lose it like that. 47-story building is a lot harder to lose. I mean, sometimes we do on a house fire, we'll cover things up and not remember where we put it, but a 47-story building, it can't happen. So Bill Manning was one of the editors for Fire Engineering Magazine. This is one of our more technical trade magazines in the fire service. We have Firehouse and Fire Engineering, our two big ones. And I remember reading this article back right after 9/11, and I just thought it was kind of crazy, but I just excused it, thinking, well, it's about money, you know, and that's what I've heard a lot from other firefighters, is it's about money. They had money to make on the steel, and they, you know, in the recycling and all that, so it was like mob contracts where they did that type of thing. Well, Bill Manning didn't agree with that, and so what he has said, and this is from one of his articles called Selling Out the Investigation. He said, fire engineering has good reason to believe that the official investigation blessed by FEMA and run by the American Society of Civil Engineers is a half-baked farce that may have already been commandeered by political forces whose primary interests, to put mildly, lie far afield of full disclosure. And this is a good point. I think all firefighters can connect with this. Did they throw away the locked doors from the Triangle Shirtwaist fire? Did they throw away the gas cans used at the Happy Land Social Club fire? Did they cast aside the pressure regulating valves at the Meridian Plaza fire? Of course not, but essentially that's what they're doing at the World Trade Center. To treat the September 11th incident any differently would be the height of stupidity and ignorance. This is still Bill Manning, and this was a call to action. And unfortunately, I didn't listen to it back then, and I'm listening to it now, and now is when I'm standing up to do something. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. The federal government must scrap the current setup and commission a fully resourced blue ribbon panel. And remember, this was written right after 9/11. A blue ribbon panel to conduct a clean and thorough investigation of the fire and collapse, leaving no stones unturned. Firefighters, this is your call to action. Visit World Trade Center investigation, a call to action. Then contact your representatives in Congress and officials in Washington and help us correct this problem immediately. Well, I didn't listen back then, but I founded Firefighters for 9/11 Truth for this reason, to come to the truth here. And what I'm putting out a call to action, too, to firefighters again. I didn't listen then, but I'm hoping more will listen now. We need more firefighters to join our organization. What's going to change this is an overwhelming force of firefighters, because they had the biggest loss of life percentage-wise of any other group. If the FDNY and other firefighters start speaking out about this, this is going to explode, and it's going to open a lot of people's eyes to what really happened. So we'll continue with this now, the destruction of evidence. I just want you to see what happened, what these professionals talk about.
We pressed early on for a full-scale investigation, and of course one of the issues was, while we were doing that, the evidence from the buildings was being destroyed as we were talking about it. And we were advocating early on back then that the process of removing the steel, certainly that wasn't an issue of getting it off the site. But once it was off the site, because this is of course part of a rescue and recovery operation, once it was off the site, there was no real need for speed, basically, to get this steel just, cut up into small pieces and shipped overseas for scrap.
The structural steel that would have been key to figuring out what happened to these buildings, what happened to that? Well, New York City accepted a plan 11 days after the attack to immediately start recycling the steel. Not even in the United States, where some of it might have gotten saved inadvertently. No, it was put on ships bound for India and China to be melted down.
We were concerned about that, and we understood early on that those are going to hold the keys to knowing exactly how the buildings came down. And unfortunately, we were not successful in getting the elected officials and the powers that be to do that. When it was all said and done, we only had relatively a very, very small portion of the steel from those buildings.
There's about 250 pieces of structural steel that we know of saved for analysis, but out of some 200,000 tons. It's hard to imagine how at a crime scene you can destroy evidence so quickly and thoroughly and get away with it.
Actually, after that, there were up to 400 truckloads per day being removed, and all but 236 pieces of steel from that crime scene remain. So, and they never analyzed it. They never tested it for thermite. There is still some steel left that can be tested, so that's what we're calling for. And you have to be the judge. I mean, this is the greatest crime in American history, the first time ever that 3 steel and concrete high-rises collapsed into their own footprint at near free-fall speed. Don't you think we should have tested this and figured it out and saved that steel? I mean, you look at an aircraft crash, they reconstruct the aircraft in a hangar. This was even greater loss of life and engineering disaster that's ever been seen. So you be the judge. Why did they destroy this evidence?
Mayor Bloomberg from New York said, just looking at a piece of steel doesn't generally tell you anything, in his response to these questions.
Myth. Fire is the obvious cause of the high-rise collapses.
Is that true? High-rises are destroyed by a number of different forces. Fires destroy buildings quite differently than controlled demolitions, for instance. We also have earthquakes, which cause the destruction of buildings. We have explosions and other types of forces. Let's look at fires first. Fire is an organic process, moves through the building about every 20 minutes or so, burning out one area, leaving it to cool, and looking for fresh new fuel sources. So in this organic process, any building that succumbs to fire, that collapses, starts usually with large gradual deformations, and the building will begin to fall over, not straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance. We've never had a high-rise collapse due to fire, even though there's been plenty of examples of much hotter, longer-lasting, larger fires. These buildings collapse by organic or natural methods, in these cases earthquakes. The structural system is not dismembered from itself. There's what appears to be a mangled building at the bottom, certainly damaged, but recognizable somewhat as a building. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. We will compare these features to what we find at ground zero. These buildings exploded. We have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. There's thick, billowing, enormous clouds from the pulverized solids of the building suspended in the air, fueled by these very, very hot gases into this cauliflower-like formation. Well, here's a controlled demolition. This is what a building looks like when it's demolished with explosives. Normally, these buildings are brought down, and they can be engineered in many ways. And of course, the way it's done is we place explosives usually on the inside of the building, and then they're set off toward the outside, and then synchronistically timed floor by floor. This results in a free fall, almost collapse, of these buildings straight down into a pile that's broken up and ready for loading and shipment. There's a specific set of characteristics associated with controlled demolition. Let's see what they are. We have a sudden onset of destruction at the base of the building. We have a straight down symmetrical collapse into its own footprint because demolition waves remove those column supports, resulting in a free fall acceleration straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance. This results in the total dismemberment of the steel structure, broken up and ready for loading and shipment. And minimal damage, of course, to adjacent structures, where we have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions, they see flashes of light. We have enormous clouds of pulverized concrete and the thick billowing enormous clouds from the explosives. Sometimes we have explosive isolated ejects, we call them squibs, appearing at different places. Maybe they're mistimed. And of course, we have chemical evidence of explosive cutter charges found in the debris left behind. This is all direct evidence of explosive controlled demolition. Interesting thing is fire can't create any one of these, let alone all 10. So if we have these features, we're pretty darn sure we had explosive controlled demolition, especially if we have government documentation. We have to apply for permits to bring these buildings down. Expert corroboration, they agree, yeah, it's a controlled demolition. Foreknowledge, they're planned months in advance so people have the word. They know it's going to come down. And video documentation. So this is all proof of a controlled demolition.
Myth. The scientific method was used in the investigation.
This is the NFPA, and the manual I've been talking about, I'll continue to talk about tonight. It talks about the scientific method, and that was one of the reasons the investigators who actually I talked to that helped write this said they wanted to set the standard. In the fire service, we have what's called the incident command system, and I'll refer to that again later. And what that is we're trying to nationalize everything so that if we go to a fire in a neighboring state or a neighboring city, we're all working off the same page. And so that's what the scientific method, that's why they applied this to the fire service and investigations. So first thing is you recognize the need. Next is to find the problem, then collect the data, analyze the data, develop a hypothesis, test the hypothesis, and then select the final hypothesis. So there's also in this manual, there's federal evidence rules, and this is pretty clear. Types of evidence, there are basically 3 types of evidence, all of which in some manner relate to fire investigators. They're demonstrative evidence, documentary evidence, and testimonial. So those are the kind of things that arson investigators and even firefighters. And just to preface my experience, I have been a firefighter. I'm not an arson investigator, but we're trained in the basics of arson investigation because we're the first ones on the scene, and we're the ones who are actually, just like the Pentagon should have been protected, we protect a scene after the fire until the investigators get there. We don't allow homeowners into the house. We don't allow anybody to go snooping through there, and we try to do as little disturbing once we get the fire out. Once we get the fire and the victims out, we stop touching it until the investigators have a chance to look at it. Generally, the cause of a fire explosion is not known until near the end. As a result, the entire fire scene should be considered physical evidence and should be protected and preserved. Makes sense. We should be protecting these scenes.
Myth. There were only 2 towers destroyed on 9/11.
This was the 3rd skyscraper to collapse on 9/11. It was about a football field in length away from what was at one time the highest buildings in the world when they were built for about a year. It may be dwarfed next to those, but it would be like the highest building in most of our states. Now, this building wasn't hit by an airplane, so its manner of destruction is really quite interesting for us researching this. It collapses at about 5:20 in the afternoon of 9/11. You can see here the North Tower has come down. Building 7 is still standing. The North Tower is already down here, and the building is still standing. Fires started about 1 o'clock in the afternoon and burned 3 or 4 hours. Let's take our first look at the collapse of this building, narrated by Dan Rather.
What you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Describe that. Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. for the third time today. It's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Dan never repeats these words again after 9/11. He's using his intuition to describe what he's seeing, which is what we should all be doing. In fact, most of us have never seen this building on mainstream television, even though it was the third worst structural failure in modern history. Let's take one more look. Smooth, symmetrical. The penthouse falls a second earlier, indicating core column damage. Well, I'm not quite convinced yet. Let's put a known control demolition on the right and Building 7 on the left. Is there any similarities? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Since every other high-rise that has ever come down in history has been brought down with explosives, and fire has never brought one down in history at all.
Myth. WTC-7 was fully engulfed in fire.
On the 12th and 13th floor at 2:30, we have fires starting in the area where the initiation of collapse is said to have begun. The problem is, by 3:50, more than an hour before the collapse of this building, those fires have moved away from that area. In other words, that area has cooled. The steel has regained its strength.
For firefighters, when you're looking at this, you see fire there on floor about 8, 9, but what we're talking about is floor 12 and 13. NIST says the collapse initiated on floor 13, column 79. So where we're talking about is on 12 and 13 there, the fire has burned out for the most part up above. So the highest intense heat is gone, so it should be cooler than what we see below.
NIST shows us massive fires. This is their fire simulation from their report. Massive fires around column 79 in the last couple hours of the building. But as you saw in the photographs, that fire is gone in that area. More likely, the fire simulation looks like this. Move through column 79 in about 20 minutes, which is how long the fires are expected to last in a given area, and moves over to this other side of the building, the east side. This is the area of the initiation of collapse because the east penthouse collapses about 6 seconds prior to the overall penthouse, which collapses about 1 second prior to the global collapse of the building. Now, at first we heard that there's massive structural damage to the south side of this building. Well, were that the case, we would expect this building to fall over toward its area that's damaged. But NIST pulls that now, and they say it was not a significant factor at all. And in addition, they say the diesel fuel lines, which were run through from the 5th floor where the diesel generators were, that was not a factor at all in the collapse of this building, diesel fuel. These were the two main reasons Popular Mechanics, for instance, one of those supporters of the official story, used to discredit the 9/11 truth movement, even though what we were talking about all along was something very different, which we'll get to, the free fall acceleration of this building. Now, the official story tells us that these long span beams heated up in the first of its kind new phenomena called thermal expansion. What these beams did is heated up and expanded. And when they did that, they knocked this girder, pushed it off of its seat on this column 79. Well, first of all, these are fireproof beams. They're not going to be expanding, they're protected. And again, those fires last about 20 minutes in a given area. So they're fully protected. Second of all, this girder is connected by shear studs to the composite metal and concrete decking up above. Also, if this girder fell off of its seat, it probably wouldn't even have reached the floor, much less cause the cascading collapse of the 12th floor onto the 11th, the 10th, the 9th, for 9 floors, leaving this column unbraced for 9 floors when they say it buckled and gave way. When that happened, this instability traveled laterally somehow through this robustly engineered building and vertically. But then we have the entire building collapsing after its inside collapses.
Myth. Fire has caused high-rise collapses before.
We've never seen it in the fire service. These are 3 examples. This first one's August 1970. It's a 50-story building in New York. It burned for over 6 hours on 5 floors. Then we have First Interstate in Los Angeles, 62-story building, burned for 3.5 hours over 5 floors. And then One Meridian in Philadelphia, 38 stories, burned for over 18 hours over 8 floors. These were well involved, and all the pictures we have, they don't match up with what we see in these other buildings.
If there was going to be any fire that would have brought a building down at the World Trade Center, it would have been at building number 5, fully engulfed in flames, as you can see. Did it come down? No. No collapse. Steel frame high-rises or mid-rises do not collapse as a result of fire. But surely this building in Beijing came down as a result of this massive fire, fully engulfing 44 floors. We would expect, if any building's going to be coming down, maybe it would be this one. Did it come down? No. High-rises are not brought down due to office fires.
Myth: free fall acceleration is normal in skyscraper collapses.
Let's listen to David Chandler, who's done an excellent analysis on just how fast this building came down. This is the analysis that forced NIST to acknowledge that the building came down, in fact, at free fall. Before this, they were denying that.
We can measure the downward acceleration of Building 7 by video frame analysis. I used a magnifying glass to place markers on the corner of the building on each frame. From this, we can get a data table and various graphs. The slope of this graph indicates acceleration, which is shown here to be about minus 10.279 plus or minus 0.6. Free fall in a vacuum is minus 9.8 in these units. That falls within the margin of error of this measurement. In other words, the rate of fall of Building 7 in the first few seconds is indistinguishable from free fall in a vacuum.
This brick that I'm holding in my hand is falling at free fall acceleration. 3, 2, 1. Why? Because there's no resistance underneath it. We can see the building gaining downward momentum with each second, increasing distance. There's no resistance from the columns to the force of gravity. What happened to the 40,000 tons of structural steel in this building?
Myth: World Trade Center Building 7 had structural damage and was expected to collapse.
And the fire service, our life depends on being able to look at a building and tell if it's going to collapse. We can't always tell. We have to make that judgment call. Buildings like this is World Trade Center 3. If I looked at that, there's no way I'm going into it. That actually, the first picture was when it was hit by the first tower. This is after it's hit by the second tower. No way you're going into it. That looks like it could collapse. The next one's World Trade Center 4, another, that's obvious damage that I'm not going to be going into that building. World Trade Center 6, no way, not going into it. So all these buildings would have been the ones that were expected to collapse. World Trade Center 7 had pocket fires on multiple floors, had no signs of major destruction that would make us scared to go into that building. In the fire service, I talked about the incident command system. There's people in here that talk about foreknowledge, or talk about it's coming down. We are not saying that these people were involved in any way, because in an incident command system or a fire scene, you get orders from above. There could be just a rumor planted somewhere, and it can trickle down. Just because we're reporting something or firefighters are, doesn't mean they're in on it.
Listen for the explosion at the beginning of this video, the mysterious construction worker turning his head around and saying, "Did you hear that? Keep your eye on that building. It's coming down."
You hear that? Keep your eye on that building. It's coming down. The building is about to blow up. Move it back. All right, guys? Sorry. We are looking back. There's a building about to blow up. On flame. Debris coming down.
Lots of confusion out on the street about this building and what it's about to do. How do they know it's about to blow up? There's a few scattered fires in there. Kevin McPadden and others were moved back 6 blocks behind Building 7. He's a first responder, an Air Force medic. Let's listen to what he hears from the radio held by the Red Cross worker.
At the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1.
Do fires bring buildings down to countdowns?
Myth: the government looked for evidence of explosives.
One of the things I looked at when I first looked into this was what do the officials say about it? What are the reports? And so I went to the questions and answers about the World Trade Center 7 collapse from NIST. This is NIST's final report. Is it possible that thermite or thermate contributed to the collapse of World Trade Center 7? And we'll get in later to what that is. NIST has looked at the application and use of thermite to determine its use to sever columns on 9/11 was unlikely. It is unlikely that 100 pounds of thermite or more could have been carried into World Trade Center 7 and placed around columns without being detected. So they're basically saying because it's hard to do, it's unlikely, because it would be difficult, we shouldn't test for it. They also say, did investigators consider the possibility that an explosion caused or contributed to the collapse of World Trade Center 7? No, and this is their answer. No blast sounds were heard on the audio tracks of video recordings during the collapse of World Trade Center 7 or reported by witnesses. They said there was no audible sound, no witnesses, no recordings, and you're going to see contrary to that tonight. But what they didn't do is they didn't read Chapter 18, the basic manual that talks about explosions. In that manual, it says very clearly, Chapter 18, although an explosion is almost always accompanied by the production of a loud noise, the noise itself is not an essential element in the definition of explosion. So you don't need to have a loud noise to consider explosives. You can have it without any noise. 18.13.2.1, identify explosion or fire. First, determine whether the incident was a fire, explosion, or both, and which came first. The evidence of an explosion is not obvious. The investigator should look for signs of an overpressure condition existing within the structure, including displacement or bulging of walls, floors, ceilings, doors and windows, roofs, other structural members. So we saw all that happen. Those buildings came apart. We obviously had all those things happen. So next, you have to identify the force vectors. So the greater the force, the farther similar pieces of debris will be thrown from the epicenter. So in Trade Centers 1 and 2, you'll see later, they were thrown great distances. We were seeing all the signs. Explosion pressures, 10 psi overpressure, you'll have probable total destruction of the building. At 30, steel towers will be blown down. Well, we obviously saw that in all three buildings. So only that kind of overpressure would cause that. The fact that we have that happen, we should suspect explosives also. High order damage is characterized by shattering of the structure, producing small pulverized debris. We had that. So this is, obviously, we see shattering the structure, small pulverized debris. 19.4.8.2.6, extremism. Terrorists may include fire as but one of a variety of weapons along with explosives used in furthering his or her goal. Well, we know they used them in 1993 on the World Trade Center. We know Oklahoma City was brought down by explosives. So if we have all this history of it, we have the manual saying you should test over and over. What are the excuses? Why did they refuse to this day to test for it?
Myth. There were no witnesses of explosions.
Let's listen to Barry Jennings.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing, when we made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor, I heard some more explosions.
What's the sound?
Like a boom. Like an explosion.
And more than one?
Yes. We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor. When we get outside, a police officer comes to me and says, you have to run. We have more information of bombs, so you have to run.
He was the emergency coordinator for the New York Office of Emergency Management. So they said there were no witnesses. That's their excuse for not testing. Well, here we have one, and we're going to see more. Now, again, one of the points I want to make from the firefighter standpoint is when you're investigating this, a lot of people say, well, there were pressure tanks, there were diesel fuel tanks, there were boilers, there was all types of things in it that they say could have accounted for those explosions. You have to back up. We're doing an investigation. You don't have to prove it before you decide to investigate whether it happened or not. When you have this kind of witnesses, remember one of the three types of evidence we talked about was witness testimony. So we have testimonial evidence of explosives. So this is a very solid reason why to test. And again, here's Kevin McPadden again.
What did he hear after the radio transmission from the Red Cross worker?
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds, you heard explosions. Like, boom! It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
And now this goes beyond witness testimony. They said there were no recordings.
Yeah, here's one of the guys who can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
Now again, they say there's no explosions. You be the judge.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
Was that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
That was the
planet probably?
Yeah, definitely secondary explosion.
I heard a second explosion and another rumble.
An hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower.
It just went ba-boom, it was like a bomb went off. And another explosion came right from it, just everyone flying.
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. There were continuous explosions.
No, the first explosion, then there was a second explosion in the same building. There were two explosions.
Okay. Federal agencies that were down there do believe that there was some sort of explosive device somewhere else besides the planes hitting.
There was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. So obviously, according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
Then there was those secondary explosions and then the subsequent collapses.
That the FBI most likely thinks that there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the buildings, which also exploded at the same time and brought both of them down.
Now that's the first time we're hearing that. So 2 planes and explosives that were in the building, is that correct?
That is the working theory at this point. That is
a huge explosion now, raining debris on all of us.
It sounded like gunfire, you know, bang, 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 and then all of a sudden 3 big explosions.
About 50 consecutive bangs, and it fell down like a waterfall.
And we heard the noise associated with an implosion.
We heard a very loud blast, an explosion. We looked up, and the building literally began to collapse before us.
We heard a loud explosion, and at that point, Building 2 was collapsing.
At that point, we heard a large boom. You know, I looked up and just saw the building coming at us.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse?
To me, it sounded like an explosion.
There was another major explosion. The building itself, literally the top of it, came down.
All of a sudden, you hear explosion, and then you could see the building starting to collapse.
Huge explosion that we all heard and felt.
We understand now there has been a secondary explosion on Tower 2.
According to the Associated Press, another building that has either been attacked or exploded.
The tower, rather, that has collapsed, though we are told, collapsed because of a third explosion.
And about an hour later after that, there was a huge explosion at the base of the South Tower. That's the One World Trade Center, and part of the building collapsed.
We could hear a rumble, which was about 5 seconds long, preceding the actual collapse, and then a boom when each of those towers collapsed.
Just seconds ago, there was a huge explosion, and it appears right now the Second World Trade Tower has just collapsed.
I was about 5 blocks away when I heard explosions.
And then you heard from far away, boom, boom.
And you heard the boom, 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 boom.
Floor by floor, it started popping out.
It was if they had detonated. If they were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
From the corner, boom, 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 boom. Just like 20 straight hits. And as the bombs were going, people just started running, and I sat there and watched a few of them explode, and it just started going pop. It just started going boom, 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 boom. And he goes, how fast? I go, like firecrackers.
Myth. The firefighters did not report explosions.
9/11 Commission had some of the firefighters come in. The firefighters said they told them about the explosions. However, none of that made it into the 9/11 Commission report. So there's absolutely no witness reports of any explosions. There's more than 118 of them who heard them. Originally, they weren't going to document this, but the City Fire Commissioner, Tom Von Essen, he wanted to preserve these accounts. And in the fire service, when we go to fires, there's a lot of times where there's just chaos, and we see one small part of that picture. And afterwards, we'll have what's called a post-fire, and we'll talk about it. And we'll see videos and pictures and stuff, and like, oh yeah, that's what that noise was, that's what this was. So we come to a collective memory, and we work together at the fire, but we come up with a memory that is almost like one, because we're told all these different things, and we realize that we didn't see it, so we put it together that way. Well, this commissioner knew that. As he quoted, to preserve the accounts before they became reshaped by a collective memory. So they didn't release these. It happened in 2001. They were collected from October to January, and it wasn't until the New York Times filed a Freedom of Information Act to get these, and so they finally got them published. So we didn't have them until August of 2005, so we just have come across these.
Myth. Jet-fueled fireballs shot down the elevator shaft and blew out the lobby windows.
NFPA 18.12.2, high explosives. High explosives are characterized by a detonation propagation mechanism. Common high explosives are dynamites, water gel, TNT, ANFO, RDX. The effects produced by diffuse phase, fuel-air explosions, and solid explosives are very different. And I want to be clear here. Diffuse phase, just put it in layman's terms, fuel-air is like the jet fuel, and that on those planes would have been a diffuse phase explosion. It wouldn't have been a high explosive. In a diffuse phase explosion, structural damage will tend to be uniform and omnidirectional, and there would be relatively widespread evidence of burning, scorching, and blistering. Now, any firefighter who's seen an explosion or a flashover, the after effects of that, we always see scorching, we see burning, you'll see soot on the roof, on the ceiling, on the walls, everything's basically burned in that room. In contrast, the rate of combustion of a solid explosive, which thermite or any of these other chemicals would have been, is extremely fast in comparison to the speed of sound. Therefore, pressure does not equalize through the explosion volume, and extremely high pressures are generated near the explosive. Pressure and the resultant level of damage rapidly decay with distance away from the center of the explosion. The Naudet brothers made a film. They recorded the first plane strike, and they came in the lobby with Chief Pfeiffer here and his crew. I want you to pay attention. What we were originally told, and in this video you're going to hear them, they plant the first seed that this was a jet-fueled fireball that came down the elevator shaft. And I just want you to think about that for a second, because if you think about an elevator shaft, there's an elevator car in there. When it's in between floors, those doors are closed. So in all those elevator shafts in the World Trade Center, there's multiple banks, and they went to different levels. So you have some mid-stops, you have some full shaft, you have some go down in the basement. There's just multiple banks of elevators. So not all of these elevator shafts go all the way down to the lobby. Vice versa, a lot of these go down into the basement. So what they've told us is that that fireball came down, blew out the lobby windows, which you're going to see here, and blew out the lobby windows. So what that means is that fireball had to find those elevator shafts, but the doors would have been closed up top where the plane struck, so it had to shear those elevator shafts at the top. Then that fireball, in an explosive way, would have had to come down that shaft, and then that would have meant those cars should have been stopped in the basement level, just the one floor below, because the elevator car would have acted as a plunger. It would have had to blow open those elevator doors in the lobby, and then I could have believed it. I originally believed it because that's what I was told. We're going to look at this video, and what I want you to pay particular attention to is the ceilings, the walls, the floors, and there's plants in here. Any fire I've been into that's consumed the entire, where you have a fireball come, well, we don't get fireballs, but when you have that type of thing happen, you're going to see some wilting of the plants, or probably they won't even be there anymore.
Pfeiffer was the first chief into the building.
So look at the damage. It's
right
not
away,
uniform.
A guy from the Port Authority told him the damage was somewhere above the 78th floor.
Look at the ceiling, perfectly white, walls white,
look around.
Plants intact.
Obvious. Something had happened right there in the lobby.
Windows, irregular damage.
You just saw that all the windows.
All the plant. Now look at the
lobby looked like the plane hit the lobby.
Look at the elevator cars when they show them.
They'd figure out that flaming jet fuel had shot straight down the elevator shaft.
All of this damage was done already.
Elevator cars intact.
People was all over the place.
Elevator doors.
So you knew it was going to be worse.
Myth. There was no reason to test for explosives.
Now again, this is from the NIST final report. We already talked about that. It's unlikely there was 100 pounds of thermite could be carried in there. Well, 18.15 in the NFPA 921 says that you should analyze the fuel source. And all available fuel sources should be considered and eliminated until one fuel can be identified as meeting all of the physical damage criteria. So if you have pulverized concrete, you need to consider fuels other than gas. Exotic accelerants, 19.2.4. Exotic accelerants. Thermite mixtures produce exceedingly hot fires. Such accelerants generally leave residues that may be visually or chemically identifiable. So indicators of exotic accelerants include an exceedingly rapid rate of fire growth, which would be expected from a jet-fueled fireball. Brilliant flares, again expected, but the one thing that's not expected is melted steel or concrete, and we're going to show you some of that. And melted steel or concrete, I've never seen it, I've never even heard of it at a fire scene.
Myth. Jet fuel and office fires explain the evidence found at Ground Zero.
Do they? Jet fuel and office fires burn about 14, 16, maybe 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Who's heard saying this? As if 21 days after the attack, the fires were still burning and molten steel was still running. none other than Leslie Robertson, the structural engineer responsible for the design of the World Trade Center, and his associate, Richard Garlock, who is quoted as saying, "Debris past the columns was red hot, molten, running." The problem here is that these temperatures are twice the temperatures that normal office fires or jet fuel can even get to. Fires burned and molten metal flowed, says this urban search and rescue worker. Saw pools of literally molten steel, says the president of the cleanup company, Tully Construction. It was dripping from the molten steel, says this firefighter. And this molten metal pouring out of the South Tower minutes before its collapse. NIST tells us that this is molten aluminum from the jet plane. But we know that molten aluminum in daylight conditions looks silvery, not bright orange and yellow. Molten steel beams to human remains. I saw melting of girders in the World Trade Center, says this structural engineer from UC Berkeley. He documents the melting of girders. Office fires and jet fuel don't do this. Nor do they do this. From the 2 or 3 pieces of steel that were saved from World Trade Center 7 and the Twin Towers, they're documented as having intergranular melting, rapid oxidation, sulfidation, sulfur forming on this hot corrosion attack on the steel, turning solid steel girders into Swiss cheese. And what happens after they pull this molten metal up from deep beneath the pile?
One of the more unusual artifacts to emerge from the rubble is this rock-like object that has come to be known as the meteorite.
It's this fused element of steel, molten steel and concrete and all of these things all fused by the heat. And architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in our lives.
Well, what is the problem here? We have the hottest office fires that are said to be in the Twin Towers, about 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. NIST claims actually 1,800 degrees. Structural steel doesn't even melt till 2,700 degrees. What could be capable of creating those temperatures? We'll be looking at a likely suspect called thermite, an incendiary that creates molten iron at over 4,500 degrees. Before we get there, though, let's listen to John Gross, lead investigator for the official story from NIST, and what is his perspective on all of this molten metal?
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like it was lava
from a volcano. Actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall.
And the cleanup was very difficult in the beginning. Steel was coming out red in certain areas from the first couple of weeks.
This fused element of steel, molten steel.
And they pulled off a big block of concrete, and there was like a little river of steel flowing.
What's going on here? Somebody is lying. Well, I'll leave it up to you to make your official determination, but if we're it, those proponents of the official story, why would they be doing this? Because they can't possibly account for the temperatures, the extremely hot temperatures associated with this phenomena.
Myth. Thermite doesn't cut steel.
Well, what is thermite anyway? Could it be responsible for all of this molten metal?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Shyam Sunder says, well, you'd need 100 pounds of thermite in the frequently asked questions. Well, we'll find out if that's true or not. This particular invention allows thermite to be packed into a cutter charge. This is patented in 1999, ejecting molten iron, the byproduct of thermite, through the structural steel in just milliseconds. But is there any evidence of thermite in the World Trade Center dust? This dust is actually pulverized concrete, 100-micron particles, most of them, scattered throughout lower Manhattan, laid like a blanket, 4 to 12 inches thick. What do official sources find in all of this dust? Billions of small, previously molten iron microspheres, the diameter of a human hair. They're so characteristic that they say it's not World Trade Center dust unless it has these small iron microspheres. They do analysis on it. They find that they are predominantly molten iron. Where did the molten iron come from? It doesn't have the alloys of structural steel, so it's not melted steel. Where could it have come from?
So as molten iron is sprayed into the air from the thermite reaction, it forms into a sphere roughly due to surface tension, and those solidify in the air. And so all that information is preserved in the dust. And we then look at the dust and we're learning a great deal about what happened.
Fascinating. Dr. Stephen Jones does his own analysis on these microspheres from the World Trade Center dust. And he takes one of his 4 samples that have been sent to him with his magnet, and he finds that not only do we have these previously molten iron spheres, but there's pulverized metal, like metal filings in there as well. Well, we know they're missing tens of thousands of file cabinets. We know we're missing metal decking. So what does he find in their chemical makeup? He finds that it's basically the same result as if you burn thermite in a controlled experiment, iron, aluminum, etc. Dr. Jones concludes, therefore, that this is significant evidence of aluminothermic reactions, whose original constituents in the unignited thermite must have been something like aluminum powders, iron oxide powder, copper oxide, zinc nitrate, potassium permanganate. So he goes back to the dust. Once again, maybe he missed something a year later. What comes up to his magnet again? These small chips, red on one side, gray on the other. They're about 1/16 of an inch long, the largest ones. They're in every sampling, hundreds of them in each sampling. Why do they come up to the magnet? Because of the iron content. He does an analysis on them. Sure enough, confirms that it's very similar to thermite. So he takes a chip, slices it open, zooms in 50,000 times. What does he see? Extremely small particles of iron oxide powder and aluminum, 1,000 times smaller than the human hair. These are at the nano scale. They have no business being that small. They're highly engineered components, perfectly uniform. 40 nanometer crystalline rhomboidal shaped iron oxide particles and wafers of aluminum powder, 40 nanometers by 400 nanometers. These are in the perfect proportion to each other to make up thermite, and they're set in an organic bed of carbon. This provides the gas that makes for the explosive work. Extremely small particles have an incredible surface area, so the chemical reaction occurs almost instantaneously. He puts it in a heater, basically, a differential scanning calorimeter, and they blow up at 420 degrees centigrade, just like the literature that's been produced on this substance. He compares the spheres that are produced from that ignition, and they match the chemicals of the spheres found in the World Trade Center dust. Fascinating. This stuff is not made in a cave in Afghanistan. It is made only in the most sophisticated Defense Department contracting laboratories. All of this work is documented very carefully in a 25-page peer-reviewed scientific paper from the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal. It is moving through scientific circles with quite a bit of controversy. Dr. Jones then concludes that these experiments through EDS, XRF, etc., identifying these various components, find that it's extremely compelling evidence that thermitic compounds were deliberately placed in both the World Trade Center, Twin Towers, and Building 7. Let's jump into the World Trade Center Twin Towers.
Myth: the Twin Towers were not adequately designed.
Even the official spokespersons for NIST say that the building did an admirable job resisting the impacts of these airliners, which they were designed, in fact, to do. There's 47 massive core columns in each tower, and these are almost solid steel at the base, thinning to 2-inch thick at mid-height and 1/4-inch thick at the top. The top is the lightest portion of the building. We have a tremendous perimeter exoskeleton structure, a Varandeel truss with 3 perpendiculars and 3 verticals, welded together and then in turn bolted together. This is the tube surrounding the core structure. This is a structure within the structure. Any collapsing of the lighter weight floor truss system spanning 60 feet between the core structure and the perimeter structure would have left the core structure standing 1,300 feet in the air, like records falling around a spindle. It's inconceivable that they would have collapsed, particularly as fast as they did. These are, in fact, evidence of explosive. Let me ask you.
In all the videos of the collapses, explosions can be seen bursting from the building 20 to 30 stories below the demolition wave. Here, 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 and here.
Well, NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, tells us that these are puffs of air being produced by that giant piston pushing air down through the elevator shafts. We'll look at that in a moment. But first of all, these are not puffs of air. These are pulverized building materials. You can see the solids. In addition, they are occurring at 160 to 200 feet per second. These are explosive speeds, not air pressure. Let's say this is the open office space, right? 60 feet wide. The elevator hoistway is behind us over here to my right. The air is going to come rushing down the elevator shaft through the doors somehow and then into this open space. It's going to equalize in pressure. And if it busts any windows out, it might bust them all. Not these highly focalized, pinpoint accurate, violent ejections that occur almost exactly at the midpoints of the facade. And they're occurring 20, 40, and even 60 stories down below this zone of destruction.
Myth: this was a classic progressive collapse.
Well, how can it be classic if it's never happened, in fact, before in history, though they use this term? Was it progressive? Well, what we have, instead of seemingly a gravitational collapse, is the equal distribution of this material outside the perimeter of each of these twin towers in a 12 to 1,400 foot radius, in fact, well beyond the boundaries of ground zero. Look at the nice, neat pile associated with World Trade Center 7. an implosion, a classic implosion. That's happened before in history, a classic explosive implosion, versus the incredible explosive event driving 9-ton perimeter wall units laterally at 60 miles an hour, instant speed out of the sides of the Twin Towers, landing well over 600 feet away.
Myth. There was a stack of pancaked floors at the bottom.
Do you see any? I don't. There's a pile about 2 stories high of perimeter wall units, core columns, other debris. You know, there were over 110 floors in this building, each of them an acre in size. This is a massive building. This is the metal decking upon which the 4-inch thick reinforced concrete was placed. There's 220 acres of this material. It's missing. It's completely missing, and 10,000 floor trusses that supported this, as well as the concrete that we already talked about, 100-micron particle size scattered throughout lower Manhattan. We talked about the small metal filings that were found throughout all of that dust. Were those the missing floor deckings and floor trusses? Where are the pancakes? In a traditional pancaking collapse, we're looking for pancakes, not unlike something like this, probably 10, 20 stories high or even higher.
Myth. The towers look nothing like a controlled demolition.
You tell me what the towers might have looked like. What I see developing already in the lower left here is upward, outward arching streamers, geometry of fireworks almost in its symmetry. Compare that to the Tongan Sea volcanic eruption and this known controlled demolition with pyroclastic-like flows. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives?
Myth. The building tenants would have seen workers planting explosives.
Well, how would they have gotten into this building to plant explosives? Let's take the floor plan and enlarge the core area where we note that each of these elevators are in turn adjacent to the core columns and the beams in the building. So if you had access to those elevator shafts, you'd have access to the core columns and beams to plant those explosives. Of course, it would be much easier if you had the cover of an operation such as the largest elevator modernization going on in history the 9 months prior to 9/11. This is one of the reasons the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth and the firefighters for 9/11 Truth are calling for an investigation of Ace Elevator, who had this contract replacing these elevator systems. They had 85 employees at the scene, and they were responsible for staying there and helping the firefighters rescue these victims. After all, this is traditional, and they are the experts in the delivery systems of those rescues. Isn't that true, Eric?
Yeah, it's true. We use security from the building, and if the elevator people are there, they're definitely help, but we use security all the time in high-rise operations to have them show us where to go and what to do.
Myth. The columns significantly slowed the collapse.
Let's see how fast it's coming down. 4 seconds. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11.
The Twin Towers came down in nearly free fall speed.
Wait a minute. What does this mean? Let's try to put this in some perspective. Let's take a 15-story section of building, just like the top 15 stories above the point of jet plane impacts in the World Trade Center Twin Towers. Hold it up with this giant crane, 95 stories over nothing but air. Next to it, the same identical building component. And this time, let's put it over 95 stories of World Trade Center building with 80,000 tons of structural steel in it, designed to resist that load. In fact, let's make it 5 times stronger than it needs to be to resist that load. Now, NIST tells us, basically, the official story, that when these cranes, the levers are pulled, these will pretty much hit the ground at the same time. How many of us think that is reasonable? No, this is 7th grade physics. We understand this intuitively. Something with resistance, particularly this much resistance, is going to slow that down significantly, if in fact it could ever begin at all. Now, what's the problem with this analogy? Where is the 15-story section that's supposed to be driving this building down? But it's not there. All of the photographs and videos show that it has in fact been destroyed. After that, it's the building tearing itself apart at 2/3 of free fall acceleration, faster and faster and faster, straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance.
Myth. The towers collapsed in a natural manner.
In the south tower, it begins to tip, which we would expect. We would expect that angular momentum to continue. It's 22 degrees off of its axis. We have asymmetrical damage from the airplanes, asymmetrical damage from the fires, and now asymmetrical loading from this portion that's tipping. But watch what happens from below. Complete symmetry, like the firemen described, like bands of explosions wrapping all the way around the building. How is it even possible?
Myth. The top block above the jet plane impacts drove the rest of the building down to the ground.
Let's see if that's true. Here's the upper 15-story section that we were just talking about. What's going on? We have explosions up at the top of the building, up here, and then it begins to go down. Now, we're going to look at this once more, and what you're going to see is that the point of jet plane impacts, which is occurring right here, there's no movement from here down until now. That upper 15-story section has destroyed itself in the first 4 seconds. Let's take a close-up look. We start, we stop. Like the firemen described, bands of explosions wrapping all the way around like a belt, not only on the lower floors here, but on the upper floors too. Start, stop, start, stop, start. It makes no sense, but look from below, where we have a violent series of ejections. Look at these outward arching, horizontally directed streamers, almost like, again, the geometry of fireworks. Look down below. You'll see violent pinpoint ejections. And on this next run, I want you to look at the lower right corner of the destruction, where racing down the diagonal corner is a series of explosions racing almost as fast as the debris falling at free fall acceleration. This is about 2/3 of that acceleration. It makes no sense unless you look at the hypothesis of explosives.
Myth. The NIST report analyzed the collapse.
They were tasked with explaining how and why World Trade Center 1 and 2 collapsed and how and why World Trade Center 7 collapsed. They spent 3 years and $20 million at this effort. Their objective, as they say, the focus of the investigation was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact to the initiation of collapse for each tower. What? The initiation? It doesn't actually include the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached, and collapse became, they claim, inevitable. Well, I don't know why it would be inevitable. Some local failure causing the entire collapse of a building has never, in fact, happened at all. Why did they stop at the initiation of collapse? Structural engineers do this for a living, calculate the ability of the structure below to resist some portion of itself collapsing in on itself. That's what they do. Had they gone any further in their analysis beyond the initiation of collapse, they would have had to have accounted for all of the evidence, the overwhelming evidence for the explosive controlled demolition of these buildings, which you have just seen. They couldn't afford to go any farther at all. What was the report titled? The final report on the collapse of the World Trade Center. There is no analysis whatsoever. It should have been called the final report on the initiation of collapse.
The physical evidence that you've seen, the science, and the real-time accounts make it apparent that our government lied to us about the building collapses. The 9/11 Commission reinforced these lies. FEMA and NIST justified them, and the corporate media repeated them and hammered them in. We were fooled. And now we have seen that explosives were used to destroy each of the 3 World Trade Center high-rises on 9/11. But it takes months of advanced planning to engineer and place these explosives. Who had the means, the opportunity, the motive to engage in this crime? Who benefited? These are the classic questions that journalists and crime investigators should be asking. Who had access to these highly secure buildings? Who had access to the extremely sophisticated explosives? AE 9/11 Truth and firefighters for 9/11 Truth do not research these important issues or even speculate. We do not have conspiracy theories. So, unfortunately, this is just the beginning of a disturbing but essential journey for you back into the nightmare of 9/11. The evidence you've seen tonight is just a small fraction of the vast body of information that the 9/11 Truth movement has assembled. The questions raised are numerous and ominous, and they must be answered in a new investigation. You will have to discover the evidence that we didn't have time to bring you tonight, and we encourage you to follow up. Thank you.
The need right now in America is for patriots to step forward and speak an unpopular truth that will, in fact, save your country. We'll take your questions now. I think Peter has a few to start with.
For an operation of this magnitude, too many people would have had to be involved. Someone would have blown the whistle. Where are the whistleblowers?
The whistleblowers will come forward when we set the groundwork, the foundation, the climate that is receptive for them. When we put enough pressure on the media and our government officials and the rest of Americans to demand a real investigation, the whistleblowers will start coming forward.
Actually, there are whistleblowers that weren't directly responsible, but Barry Jennings is a classic example. He was there inside. The official story said there were no explosions. He came out and he went on TV and said there were. He died later. We don't know what the cause of death was. We're not speculating on that, but he died right before the NIST report came out on that. There's also Sybil Edmonds from the FBI. She was a translator. She was gagged for years. She had information that she wanted to share, and the NSA said it was national security, wouldn't let her come out. So she was a whistleblower. So there have been whistleblowers, and they have been punished for coming out.
If you're looking for a few thousand whistleblowers, go to patriotsquestion911.com and see many categories of whistleblowers: intelligence, law enforcement officials, media professionals, lawyers for 9/11 Truth, firefighters for 9/11 Truth, architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, scholars for 9/11 Truth, many, many organizations.
If what you're suggesting is true, the liberal media would have picked up on this story a long time ago.
That's what I thought for years. They would tell us in the media, and every time a story like this came up, they were able to debunk it as far as I was concerned. So I was shocked. But now that I've looked at this from a different side and been part of this and trying to get our word out there and seeing just the brick wall that we come up against to get into the media, tonight you don't see any mainstream TV stations, CNN or ABC here.
They have all been invited as well.
Yeah, they've been invited, but they don't show up.
On the left and the right. We appear to have as much trouble with the left liberal media as we do the right. Personally, I don't think either really exists in the mainstream media. They appear to be working as a unit, similarly to our congressmen, the Democrats and the Republicans, who are not working in our best interests at all.
9/11 is ancient history now. I wouldn't believe it even if it were true.
Well, I'll take the first part of that. 9/11 sparked two major wars in which already over 1 million people have died, and thousands of U.S. soldiers, of course, and many other soldiers as well. And the controlled demolition of our cherished civil rights here in the United States through legislation, the Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act, other acts which have really demolished our civil rights. These are current events. All of the roots of the problems, including our major economic crisis right now, many believe, go back to 9/11. We pull the string on 9/11, and all of the dominoes, which we haven't even mentioned today, start to fall one at a time. This is the Achilles heel of the power structure that set this in place. Let's go after it with focused attention that we do not yield whatsoever until the dominoes are falling. Peacefully.
I appreciate what you're doing, but I'm trying to keep a low profile.
That's a great question, and I hear that all the time from friends and family. If you look to the past, look at the results. We have been keeping quiet. If we want to see a different future, and we're seeing our world change drastically in front of us right now, and if you're afraid now, like I talked about with my friends, we say we're from a free country, that we live in a free country. Well, if we're in a free country, why are we afraid to just talk about an event that was the most traumatic event in our history?
Our government has never done such a thing as murder 3,000 of its own people.
Well, we're not saying that our government did this. We don't speculate about who the perpetrators might be. We provide the scientific forensic evidence found at the crime scene, the eyewitness testimony, and what investigations should have been done. But there are several examples of major wars and minor wars that all have been started with similar false flag operations. What are a few of those?
The big one was the Gulf of Tonkin. It started the Vietnam War. We were told that's what happened, and it's come out now from Robert McNamara that it never happened. So the entire Vietnam War was based on a lie, and it's been publicly admitted. USS Liberty was another one to try to get us into the 7-Day War. It's come out that that was a staged event. And the other big one that most people don't even know about is Operation Northwoods. And that was one, when I first looked into this, that I looked at, and if you haven't seen this, you have to go to the National Archives and look up the declassified Operation Northwoods. It was a proposed military action for justifying invasion of Cuba. And it was very clear on their tactics. And their tactics, some of them were very similar to a 9/11 type event. They talked about doing terrorist acts in Miami and DC. They also talked about taking airliners and substituting them with other planes and then simulating an explosion with the airplane to make the world think that it was attacked by a Cuban MiG. So that never happened, and there was one person who stopped it. He's dead now. President Kennedy stopped it. The fact that they showed then that they have the motive, or they even consider it, we shouldn't shut down our mind or our investigation and just rule this whole thing out because it could never happen. Our country was founded on questioning our government. So what's happened where we don't even question them anymore when we have so much overwhelming evidence of what they've done in the past? This is insane.
I believe what you guys are saying. I want to help. What can I do?
Oh, there is so much you can do, and guess what? You can do it at your computer. Send the AE911truth.org link to every architect and engineer you can find. Send the firefighters for 9/11 Truth to every firefighter and company that you can find. You have the tools now to follow up. It's extremely important that you do. So we're asking all of you to demand a new investigation. Call and write your congressman, television stations, letters to the editor. However you have to do it, there's action that each of you are called to do. Sign our petitions, the AE 9/11 Truth petition and Firefighters for 9/11 Truth, demanding a real investigation. You can sign our petition here and on the Firefighters website as well. We ask you to become a sustaining member as well for Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth and for Firefighters for 9/11 Truth. Most of all, we're asking you to speak the truth about 9/11, for a time comes when your silence is in fact betrayal. Thank you so very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here tonight. Can we have a big round of applause for Eric Lawyer and Richard Gage?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Al, can you turn on the lights for me up here? Thanks so much. You're still here. Sounds like you hopefully learned something. I'm delighted to bring this film to you. The content in the film is we're just so proud of it. There are other films that we have made, particularly 9/11 Explosive Evidence, Experts Speak Out. How many of you have seen this film? We've had it out for 2-3 years. This is the landmark film with 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts in this documentary, all laying out the evidence for the explosive demolition of the 3 towers. A lot more detail, a lot more specific documentary evidence. Really, really well done. And it is available today. And by the way, tonight we've accumulated a lot of really good stuff. So it is all on sale tonight, 2 for 1. You buy anything, you can get something else like it for free. So please take advantage of that, because this is a $20 film, so that makes it $10, basically. And 9/11 Blueprint for Truth, 2-hour research edition, a lot more detail than you saw here. And that's me giving out the information. David Hooper was having marital problems as a result of his diving down the rabbit holes of 9/11, so he made a film to try to save his marriage. It worked. Anatomy of a Great Deception, really good film tonight. Once again, 2 for 1. You don't have to buy 2 of these. You can get any 2 for the price of 1. And 9/11 Blueprint for Truth, a 10-minute, 30-minute, and 60-minute abridged version of the 2-hour version of 9/11 Blueprint for Truth, the 2-hour research edition. This is cut from this, so people with less attention spans that you run into can benefit from that. Tonight's film is also available here, and for those of you who want to just wear the T-shirt and get people to come up and say, what is this T-shirt about? Rethink911.org. The evidence might surprise you. Did you know a 3rd tower fell on 9/11? So there's a lot of resources in the back. Kate, can you stand up and hold your hand high? It's all back on that table. And I want to encourage you to take advantage of my graciousness tonight on the 2 for 1 sale. We want everything gone. In fact, if you say to Kate, Kate, I don't have any money. I really want that DVD right there. What are you going to say, Kate?
I'll trade like a watch for it or something.
She's being funny. That's why I like her. Now, I asked you 3 questions before. I'm going to ask you the same 3 questions. How many of us agree with the official story? How many of us are unsure? How many of us already, at this point, agree with the evidence for controlled demolition? First, the official story. How many of us pretty much agree with the official story? We didn't have any before. I hope you don't have any now. I may have turned you the wrong way. Unsure. You might still be unsure. 1, 2, 3. Thank you. 4. Unsure. 5. And how many of us think the towers were brought down by explosive demolition after seeing the film? Wow. A lot of the rest of you. So at this point, I would like to answer your question, and sir, you are first. Now, we actually do have the opportunity to have everybody hear your question, and Al is going to come forward and help me. Right, Al? Al is going to come forward and help me. Al, you're going to come forward and help me with this process. Testing. With this microphone, you got to put it in your face. That way you can hear it. Al, can you stand here? Come up to the microphone if you want so everybody can hear your question.
You want me to come up to the microphone?
Yes, Al's going to hold it for you, and you can take it from Al and put it in your own. Yeah, let's do that. That's fantastic.
How are you?
Now, hold it right into your face.
Sure, no problem. It's right in my face. Can everyone hear me? Okay. You know, I've been fascinated with many. Is it off? We can hear it.
It is not working. But guess what?
This one might work. Testing, testing, testing. But you only get so much distance with that. Hello? That work? I'm not sure. Can you hear me back there?
Yeah.
I don't have a volume on that. I don't even know where it is.
I'll try to speak up.
Okay.
You know, for many years I've been fascinated with the expertise of those that can implode buildings. And I remember here in Watertown, when they were bringing the B.F. Goodrich down, in the building where the vulcanizers were, the supports there were so strong that they actually miscalculated. The stuff went up in the air and came back down in one piece. Anyways, I took advantage of the opportunity when they were taking down the Travelers building here in Boston. It was a 16-story building that was close to the Central Artery, and they took it down one Sunday morning. And it fascinated me. First of all the stuff was taken out of the building. Throughout the building, they placed explosives. And as I watched the first explosion go off, you would hear one explosion after another along with a flash. Multitudes of flashes, multitudes of explosions. And when I looked at these, and I've seen the same thing on television, I did not see what I saw in the Travelers building in these buildings. And as I looked at it, I said, gee, I said, you know, it's coming down like a professional implosion. But I don't see the flashes as I did then, and the multitude of explosions. So when I first heard about pancake collapse, it sort of made sense to me. And again, I'm not an engineer or anything else. I'm only applying a little common sense situation. So it made sense to me. And that's what I believe. And I wish you could answer the question for me because, you know, I could go on and on. The 19 hijackers, several of them went to flight school and only wanted to learn how to fly a plane and not land it. So, you know, I don't think there's any question there with the hijackers. Now, in the event that our government was trying to implode the buildings, honestly, I cannot believe that they could put enough holes in it and put enough explosives without someone realizing it. So it sort of doesn't make sense to me. But I came in here with an open mind, and so I'd like to hear more.
Yeah, great question. Because in normal controlled demolitions, they use high-energy explosives like C4 and RDX. But those have bright flashes and loud bangs. And that's quite a visual and audio signature that they might not want in a deceptive controlled demolition. So what did we end up with? Thermite, which has much lower audio signature. But we do have quite a bit of evidence, as you've seen, for thermite. And I hope that helps. And flashes of light are seen by dozens of the witnesses, first responders, who are on the audio recordings. And you don't see it, you didn't see those in this film, but the work by Graham McQueen on the Journal of 9/11studies.com, an article entitled 118 Witnesses of Explosions. A lot of those saw bright flashes at various floors. So this is really important evidence that we get with a visual signature that we do get some of with thermite. We do get some explosions from thermite, and because they heard it, but not the incredible loud bangs that we associate with normal controlled demolitions. Remember, this is a magic show. This is a grand illusion. We're asked to focus on the extremely bright, by the media, the extremely loud visual impact of the airplane explosions and associate that with the building's demise. But what happens is after that, an hour after that, when the buildings come down, that's when the evidence for the explosive demolition occurs. So they try to minimize that and the time distance, the time between the one event and the other, the planes and the buildings collapse. Hope that helps. Who's next? Yes. Now, Al, you want to try and do that? Did you hand that to her?
Have you tried to, have you approached an audience at MIT, and if so, what do you get?
We've spoken at MIT at least once. I went and met with Noam Chomsky. How many of you know about Noam Chomsky? One of our greatest, I was going to say allies, but not really. He's done a lot of great work for the country. And Dave Schlesinger, raise your hand. Dave and I went down there. Dave got us an appointment with Noam. We took 72 peer-reviewed papers and put them on his desk. We got a picture of myself and him also. And Noam has been quite an opponent of the 9/11 truth movement. Some people are so smart that they're just, you know, not able to be open-minded. How many of you have talked to people like this? About 9/11 truth. We've got some pretty rational evidence here, but Noam says, I don't want to talk about that. I'm not an engineer. I'm not an architect. Well, 12-year-olds can figure out that Building 7 is coming down with explosions, the fire. The few small scattered fires can't bring that building down. But many adults don't get it. PhDs don't get it. Brilliant people like Noam Chomsky don't get it. But we did speak, when did we speak at MIT and gave a full-on presentation? 2007. Correct. The year after I got started. Dave, you want to add anything else about Noam Chomsky?
I would. He actually made some interesting suggestions he's made to me before. He was my professor.
At MIT, where Dave graduated.
Yeah. He has proposed that you can't really expect the government to have an investigation, just like you can't have like courts investigate the Vietnam War or the Iraq War. It's just too broad. He said that the precedent is the Russell Tribunal. Bertrand Russell had a tribunal that investigated the Vietnam War. And of course, the mantle of Russell would now be Noam himself, which I think most truthers would be horrified if Noam were to be in charge of any tribunal looking at 9/11. But anyway, that is a suggestion he has made before. And he also made something actually more useful. He suggested we go to the American Physical Society and the American Society of Civil Engineers and challenge them to investigate it. Now, we actually attempted to get a booth at the American Society of Civil Engineers this year, and they wouldn't let us. So, but that, Richard has said that he will support my helping to pull together a more concerted effort among our civil engineers and our physicists to get into those places in the future. So I'm sure we'll be making announcements about that, but you can certainly talk to me about it. And I want to raise one other thing related to Noam. He has said, "Oh, don't go. I don't want to deal. I can't deal with the science. Go to Science for the People or the Union of Concerned Scientists." And I actually have talked to the Union of Concerned Scientists, and they are very clear. No one will talk about things with me. They were very clear. No discussion. So I am looking to have a campaign against the Union of Concerned Scientists to have a even private dialogue. If there's anybody here who might be willing to help me, this would be outside of AE, would be able to just dialogue with me about efforts to appeal to the Union of Concerned Scientists right in Harvard Square. Please raise your hand so I can talk to you afterwards.
Awesome. Right up there in front.
One? Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you so much. To you too. Okay. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave, so much. And another question over here.
Many years ago,
It is. We can hear it.
Many years ago, I heard about thermite and thermate and freefall, and how that explains the molten, because it burns at between 3,000 and 4,000 degrees. But there's also all the cement, which didn't come out in chunks. It became completely on a microscopic level, which doesn't explain why it explodes. Somebody has brought up the notion of going to Nikola Tesla, sort of guy, interesting fellow, and the use of also particle beam weapons, or particle beams that can turn concrete dust, just dust, which had nothing to do with the molten steel aspect, and that this might have been a more sophisticated operation. And does anybody know about this notion of how these particle beam things work? And because it was a pretty smart operation, as others are.
Thank you. There are several different theories out there about how the towers came down. One of them is directed energy weapons promoted by Judy Wood. And in that book, How Did the Towers Fall, she says very clearly that the evidence for explosions, which you saw amply documented here tonight, doesn't exist. There were no explosions. That the evidence for hot molten iron doesn't exist, but you saw several examples of that just tonight. And she says that the nanothermite, which you've seen lots of evidence for as well, didn't exist. So here's somebody who's actually provided no evidence for a theory that she posits, directed energy weapons, and yet denies the most fundamental, basic scientific forensic evidence that we do have proof for. So I have reason to be suspicious. That's not to say that there wasn't other technologies involved, but we don't have evidence for it, so I'm not going to be talking about it. The same for nuclear weapons, which has been posited as an alternative theory, mini-nukes in the towers. The nukes that we know about provide extremely bright flashes, the brightness of the sun, which couldn't be hidden. Extremely loud bangs that couldn't be hidden. I mean, bangs that you hear throughout New York. And massive radiation, which we don't have. So what they say is, well, these are fourth-generation mini-nukes, and they've improved them a lot since then. Well, we don't have that on the body publicly available to discuss the science about. So we're not going to. And that's not to say that there might be any number of high-tech nuclear weapons or whatever that we don't even know about that were used. We can talk about what we have evidence for. This is what we can take to a court of law, which we're trying to get into, and making little progress of. But when we do, this is what we have the solid scientific evidence for. So I hope that helps. Yes, sir.
When Noam Chomsky says that he doesn't understand it, I don't believe what he says. I think he's a very intelligent human being. He's a professor emeritus at MIT. There's no reason why he couldn't understand it. There's another explanation why he and people like Amy Goodman and Democracy Now! Will not discuss it either. It's because they can't. They're under some sort of threat, blackmail, or whatever you want to call it, that prevents them from talking about it. In the case of Amy, I think it's the foundations would take her program off the air. And she probably figures, well, it's better that I'm on the air and talk about everything but that, rather than have my program off the air. What Chomsky's under pressure, I don't know. I mean, he obviously wouldn't talk about it. We may never find out. But I don't believe that.
It is now 8:30 and the Watertown Library will be closing in 30 minutes. Thank you.
So while we're answering the last few questions, I want to make sure that you have the opportunity to get on our mailing list. So I'm going to pass these mailing email lists around to make sure that you're on it. If you're getting our emails already, you don't need to put it down. Please do, though, write very carefully because 20% of these emails lists we can't read. So there's a problem. Put your phone number too, so that if we can't get your email read, we can call you and ask you what it is. Also, some of you didn't have a chance to donate at the door because you were here early or came in late. I want to make sure you have that opportunity, and also to support us at AE 9/11 Truth. For those of you who have seen the film and realize now how critical our work is, as we are perceived as the tip of the spear, heading for the Achilles heel of the perpetrators of 9/11, with the most credible evidence the 9/11 Truth Movement has. Please support us. Some of you are capable of writing a check without discomfort financially for $100 or $1,000. That would be extremely helpful. We have a lot of work to do that we can't do without you. Some of you could put in another $10. That'd be fantastic. Some of you can't give more. That's fine. Just pass the box on and we'll help those who can. So please try to keep this box going quickly so that it can make it back in the next 10 minutes that we have before the library closes. Now we'll take our next
9/11 Truth. Go ahead and sign up the AE 9/11 Truth email request just to make sure that we're going to do our best to make sure you get all of our sign-ups if you want to make sure you don't get missed.
Just a couple of questions. It wasn't clear, the ACE elevator company, did they show up to work that day? It was unclear whether they assisted the firemen or not or something.
They did. ACE Elevator had 85 employees in the building at the time the towers were hit by the planes. They left without helping the firefighters. It was really quite a scandal documented in USA Today in October. So we run an investigation of ACE Elevator, which would have given, of course, immediate access to the court halls and things right adjacent to those elevator shafts.
And John Gross, who was on there from NIST or something, John Gross, that he was lying about the thermite.
Yes.
He's true because the thermite didn't do it. The heat of the thermite did it.
Well, he said there's no pools of thermite, so he lied.
Yeah, but I mean, you say the thermite didn't do it. What is the expression?
Okay.
A way of lying to himself. But I'd like to know if people here believe the coercion that this gentleman mentioned, we do a raise of hands, who believes that some of the people like Amy Goodman and Chomsky are intimidated to do it. Well, I think they are. Does everyone pretty much think they are?
Yes, thank you. Next question.
Anybody?
Come on up, everybody. We only get that so far. Can you stand up, please? Yeah. Thank you.
My question is, you mentioned early in the documentary that there appears to be a line with picking up the debris at the Pentagon. I'm just curious where those photographs were published and if the people in the were identified. Were those Pentagon employees?
Donald Rumsfeld was one of them. I think he's a Pentagon employee. Many others, of course, were out there, and I'm sure they can be identified. But those are photos that are publicly available. They're not like conspiracy theorist photos. Yes, sir.
My question, I don't need the mic.
Can you stand up so people know where the voice is coming from?
Say, mic check.
Mic check.
Yeah. Of which I was a veteran from 75 high, so we were in occupied well. So my question is, and we remember I brought the Harvard Word.
I remember you.
Okay, so my question is, after 8 years of organizing, with all of the presentations of the evidence the group and others in the group have made, the question is, are there 10 or so congressmen whose names you could share with us who've been identified as most likely to support legislation for a new investigation? Are there 10 of them? If not, are there 5 billion? Whose names, congresspeople, representatives, whose names you could share with us, who after 8 years of organizing, you've identified as most likely to support the call for legislation?
None in office that I can think of.
Even one of them?
No. I'm really sorry to hear that. Gene, this one is intended to go back, all the way to the back. How far did this box get? No, I started it at the front. Then it went halfway and then started coming back. So how far did the box get? All the way to the back? Okay, can somebody take it back to Kate back there? That box, thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
So there's a name of no congressman you can share with us?
No. We're not doing well. Could you remind me of your name? Lenny, that's good.
We met at the top, on the roof of the 57 Walker Street, 56 Walker Street.
Next question. Yes, ma'am. Could you stand up, please?
When I asked you about MIT, I did that for a purpose because I didn't mean to go so much to professors or to important people, but if you could get some graduate students on a project like this, some bright, they won't be as scared, they won't have as much to protect. It would have to be a sort of a covert, you know, attractive. That was all my thought. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good points. Next question. Right? Let's go to the gentleman behind you.
Just the thing about airplane crashes. Supposedly it was an airplane that crashed into the Pentagon, but there was absolutely no wreckage. And those engines are titanium engines. They don't melt. And other parts of an airplane don't melt. There was no wreckage of any aircraft at all, inside or outside the building, that I know of. I mean, I'm just...
Well, that's quite disputed. Can I turn your point into a general question about the Pentagon? Because AE 9/11 Truth doesn't cover the Pentagon for some very good reasons, which I'll tell you about. But all of us in the 9/11 Truth movement agree that nothing should have hit the Pentagon. It is the most highly defended building in the world. And it has surface-to-air missiles, and yet this plane, which is said to have come at the Pentagon, was flown by whom? A Hani Hanjour who failed Cessna flying school. Nevertheless, here's the Pentagon, here's the plane, and what does it do? Fly straight down into the vulnerable roof structure, which is the easiest target to hit? No, it flies around in a corkscrew, descending 3,000 feet per minute, 270-degree spiral, and ends up hitting what, we're told? Well, what is destroyed is the the Office of Naval Intelligence, which controlled the auditing department with many civilians looking for the $2.3 trillion that Donald Rumsfeld had admitted was missing from the Pentagon budget the night before 9/11. So we certainly want an investigation of the Pentagon, which is withholding dozens and dozens and dozens of high-res videos which would show exactly what did or didn't hit the Pentagon. Right here. Did you stand up and face the audience?
So the fact that whoever did it, understood the psychology of our society. There are 5 people, I respect them, but I mean, after seeing this, you can't believe it. Like, it's just emotionally impossible for some of the population to accept it. A lot of my friends don't want to hear this, so it's too disturbing. So like the 5 people here that saw it that said they still don't believe, that's part of what you're up against. And they knew, the people that did this right in front of our face, did it, know the psychology, whatever it is, of the unacceptance of this reality.
Pretty incredible, isn't it? And the media doesn't report this. Well, who owns the media? Well, it turns out that Project Censor, the think tank in Sonoma State, finds that 95% of the media is controlled by just 6 corporations. Who owns those corporations? You say 5, it may very well be 5 now. Well, the same interlocking boards of directors that control corporations in the arms industry, the oil industry, the banking industry, the insurance industry, all of whom profited enormously from the events of 9/11. So this investigation has to go well beyond the destruction of buildings, right? We're talking about people in very high places probably that are pulling the strings here. We don't have, of course, theories about that, but we're starting with what we can to hit people over the head with a 2x4, as we did during the last 3 days at the Boston Convention with 10,000 architects and 36 volunteers. How many of you volunteered over the last 3 days? Thank you guys so much. Incredible work that we did there, achieving 100 or more, within 100 petitions, and waking up probably 1,000 architects to be all talking together. Next question, right here.
You mentioned, again going to the Pentagon, you mentioned the plane or whatever the object was coming down in a corkscrew. Is that more typical of a missile than?
It's more typical of a fighter jet. So if it was some kind of a plane, and there were people who saw planes, there were all kinds of witnesses. The Pentagon issue is full of misinformation, disinformation, lack of information. That's why we have the 9/11 truth movement fighting over what did or didn't happen there. No. We're talking about something a plane would do, but a missile probably could, I suppose.
So how do you know that these high-res videos exist showing whatever that object was? I mean, have you seen it, or have you spoken to someone?
No. I mean, this is the most highly defended building in the world with a lot of security. So we all assume that they have these cameras.
Satellites.
What?
Satellites.
Well, the satellites too. But the high-res videos from the nearby Citgo gas station and the hotel were confiscated by the FBI within 10 minutes after 9/11. They were on the job taking this. So those could be released. We don't have those. In the back, any other questions? Okay, last question from Lenny.
How do you see the analogy, if you see any, between everything that is with obvious truth of what you said about the critique of the government's version of this, and compared with precisely that which followed the execution of the Commander-in-Chief 38 years previous?
Anybody want to take that one on?
No, that's for you.
Well, I don't have an answer to it.
The analogy.
I can say something.
Let's pick it up. I don't know.
There's a wonderful book out called, maybe, I don't have the actual name, Unprecedented. It's the reason why JFK died.
Unspeakable.
Unspeakable.
By Jim Douglas, and he did 12 years of incredible research, and index that is about 80 pages. So I highly recommend the videos on Jim Douglas in that book, and the one that's coming out on RFK, Malcolm X.
Actually, there's a brand new book just came out titled The Devil's Chessboard, subtitled Ellen Dulles, the CIA, the Rise of America's Secret Government, which I think, without even having barely begun, but from 100 links on the web to commentaries about this new book, October 13th it came out. The big publisher, HarperCollins, David Talbot is the author, who was the founder of Salon.com in San Francisco, by the way. And it traces the history of Allen Dulles relative to the absorption of 800 German Nazi intelligence officers into the founding from the inception of the CIA under a guy's supervision by the name of Reinhard Gehlen, whose 800 subordinates were called the Gehlen Org, or organization, and that even predated and yet implicates the perpetrators behind the coup d'etat, which actually predated 9/11 by 38 years.
Thank you.
9/11 is not a coup d'etat.
Great job, Lenny.
It was already the seizure of State Tower happened in Dallas 38 years previous.
Well, Douglas is good as well. And this new book is more. Good.
Great. Thank you. Now, just two more announcements. Dave, can you help Kate at the back with the book sales back there? Because I'm going to send everybody back, and Kate's going to get overwhelmed.
The woman raised the MIT.
What? I can't hear you.
I want to speak to the woman raised the MIT.
Oh, go ahead. If we can get some more help for Kate with the owls, please, you guys take home DVDs. If you can't afford it, ask them for a free one. Thank you so much, everybody. Really appreciate it. Join us also at, what's the name of the place, Al?